Before breakfast, Andrew Oliver was a respectable Boston merchant. By lunch, he was a scarecrow hanging from an elm tree, a devil peeping out of a boot beside him, and the British Empire still did not know it was already burning. August 14, 1765. The sun climbed over the docks, and something on Orange Street was wrong. A life-size dummy swung from the branches of a huge old elm, stuffed with straw, dressed in clothes everyone recognized. Next to it, a leather boot with a little devil figure peeking out, like the devil himself was nodding along. Somebody had painted a rhyme. What greater joy did ever New England see than a stamp man hanging on a tree? The stamp man was Andrew Oliver. He hadn't committed a crime. He'd accepted a job. Parliament, 3,000 miles away in London, had passed a law called the Stamp Act, and Oliver agreed to be the man who handed out the stamps. He probably thought it was a bureaucratic post. Collect the fees, mail the receipts, keep the empire ticking. Respectable work for a respectable merchant. He was wrong. By the time the crowd was done with him that night, he'd stand under that same tree and publicly resign a job that hadn't paid him a single shilling. The tax was cheaper than a newspaper. The reaction tore the roof off a mansion. But why a dummy was swinging at dawn starts 2 years earlier, the moment the British Empire opened its ledger and quietly screamed. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763. Britain won. The French got kicked off the continent. Maps were redrawn. Victory parades were glorious. Then the Treasury sat down and looked at the numbers. National debt had roughly doubled to £133 million. Let that number breathe. The annual interest payments alone ate half the government's entire budget. And on top of that, Britain now had 10,000 soldiers sitting in North American forts, drawing pay, eating rations, wearing out boots, all to make sure the defeated French didn't get ideas. Somebody had to pay. Prime Minister George Grenville looked across the Atlantic and saw roughly 2 million colonists who, from his chair, had just been saved from French domination at enormous British expense. The colonists saw it differently. They'd fought in that war too. They'd lost sons and burned farms and buried neighbors. But the ledger told Parliament a simple story. We protected you. Now help with the bill. So Grenville's team designed a tax. Not a big one. A tiny stamp duty on legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, pamphlets, commercial papers. Every time you signed a contract, bought a newspaper, or picked up a deck of cards, you'd pay a few pennies and get a little stamp to prove it. The Treasury projected about £60,000 a year, a fraction of the defense costs, a modest contribution from grateful colonists. Follow the receipt. On paper, it looks so reasonable. The receipt was a trap. Here's why. A tax folded into the price of imported sugar? You barely feel it. The cost disappears into the shelf price. You never have to look a tax collector in the eye. But a stamp is different. It's a public, physical transaction. You walk into an office, hand over hard coin, and a government agent presses a mark onto your property. Your newspaper now carries a visible brand that says the state can reach into your pocket whenever it wants. Every customer sees the mark. Every neighbor knows you complied. The stamp wasn't a hidden duty. It was a performance of obedience. And the colonists weren't given a role in writing the script. The Virginia House of Burgesses saw the problem instantly. May 1765. A young lawyer named Patrick Henry stood up and pushed through resolutions declaring that only Virginia's own assembly could tax Virginians. Those resolves tore through the colonies like fire through dry grass. Parliament had reached straight into colonial pockets without knocking, without asking, without a single elected American in the room when the decision was made. No taxation without representation. It wasn't a slogan yet. It was a diagnosis. The agent was making decisions without the principal, and the bill was arriving anyway. Andrew Oliver accepted the stamp distributor job that summer. He wasn't a villain. Wealthy merchant, well-connected, brother-in-law to the lieutenant governor. The kind of man who sees a government post as a civic duty. But in Boston's wharves and taverns, the news landed like a fist. Oliver would be the hand pressing the stamp onto their newspapers, their contracts, their cards. He'd collect the money and send it to London. He was the receipt made flesh. A secret group of artisans and merchants called the Loyal Nine began organizing. Samuel Adams, later synonymous with revolution, was in the mix, stirring. They planned something for August 14th, the day Oliver's appointment became public. Dawn broke. The effigy went up on the elm, the boot and the devil went up beside it. The crowd gathered. This wasn't a random mob. It was political theater, fully scripted. The effigy dressed in Oliver's style. The boot a jab at the Earl of Bute, a despised British minister, the devil inside whispering who really pulled the strings. The rhyme spelled it out for anyone who could read, and for those who couldn't, the image was unmistakable. A tax collector isn't a public servant. A tax collector is a scarecrow. The crowd took the effigy down and marched it through the streets, straight to Oliver's newly built stamp office. They smashed it. Then they moved to his mansion. Oliver wasn't home. Didn't matter. Windows ripped out, furniture destroyed, sections of the roof torn off. They weren't looting. Every broken beam was a message. Your receipt is not welcome here. Your authority stops at this door. By evening, Andrew Oliver stood under the Liberty Tree, the same tree that held his effigy at dawn, and publicly resigned a job he'd never actually performed. No stamps had been issued. No tax collected. The Stamp Act, in Boston, was already dead. The Empire's clever £60,000 shortcut produced the most visible act of defiance in colonial history, and the revenue collected was exactly zero. Parliament thought it was asking for a small contribution. It was actually liquidating its own authority, and the liquidation sale was just getting started. 12 days later, August 26th, the mob went for a bigger target. Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor, the second most powerful man in Massachusetts. Hutchinson wasn't a stamp distributor. He was royal authority itself, in skin and bone. The crowd surrounded his grand mansion. Hutchinson barely escaped with his family before they broke in. What happened next wasn't random destruction. Furniture smashed, curtains shredded, walls stripped. Then they went for something specific. Hutchinson's library. Irreplaceable historical documents and manuscripts, papers he'd spent years gathering for a history of the colony. The crowd pulled them from shelves, tore them, scattered them into the street. They weren't just wrecking a house. They were erasing the official record, the Empire's version of who owned this place and who had the right to command. When the mob left, the mansion was a skeletal shell. A house that had represented royal prestige was now an open wound in the middle of Boston, visible to everyone. The bill was no longer about stamps. The bill was about who got to write the rules, and the colonists had just submitted their answer in splinters and torn paper. The fire spread. By November 1st, the day the Stamp Act was supposed to take effect, stamp distributors across all 13 colonies had resigned under pressure. In New York, a crowd burned the governor's carriage. In Rhode Island, they threatened to level houses of anyone who cooperated. In Annapolis, they tore down a stamp office before it could open. Not a single stamp was sold in any major port. The efficient little tax parliament had designed to be painless and invisible, became impossible to collect before a penny reached the treasury. Parliament looked across the ocean and watched its authority evaporate in real time. And it made the classic empire mistake. It couldn't let go. March 1766, London repealed the Stamp Act. The tax was dead. But on the exact same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The translation was brutal. Fine, we'll cancel this bill. But just so you know, we still own you. We can reach into your pocket whenever we choose. The receipt was torn up, but the claim behind the receipt stayed locked in law, waiting to be activated again. This was the sunk cost trap snapping shut. Britain had spent a fortune to win the war. spent more to garrison the territory, just spent its authority trying to extract a tiny revenue stream that yielded nothing. Admitting the whole project was a financial mistake would mean writing off the original investment. So instead, Parliament doubled down. The Declaratory Act wasn't a tax, but it kept the wound open. It told the colonists the core insult wasn't a mistake. It was policy. The next revenue acts arrived on schedule. The Townshend Acts in 1767, taxing glass, paper, paint, tea. The Tea Act in 1773, giving the East India Company a monopoly, dumping cheap tea on the colonies, undercutting local merchants while still carrying the same principle. Parliament could tax without consent. The colonists didn't object to the price. They objected to the monopoly, the principle. The same old receipt arriving in a new envelope. Boston Harbor filled with tea leaves in December 1773. The harbor was the reply. Parliament sent a receipt. The colonists sent it back wet and ruined, and the Empire answered with the coercive acts, closing the port, dissolving the Massachusetts government, quartering soldiers in private homes. Every escalation made the original £60,000 tax look smaller, while the cost of enforcement grew fatter. By the time shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the ledger told a story no one in Parliament wanted to read. The Stamp Act was designed to raise £60,000 a year. It raised zero. The Townshend Acts were supposed to raise £40,000. They raised a fraction, and the enforcement costs dwarfed the revenue. The Tea Act was meant to rescue a failing monopoly and quietly assert parliamentary authority. It produced a harbor full of loose-leaf political statement and a military occupation that cost more than any tax could cover. The final bill arrived in 1783 at the Treaty of Paris. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. The line item no one forecast, North American colonies, lost. The cost wasn't just the 13 colonies. The cost was a continent, a trading partner, a geopolitical rival, a century of accumulated imperial investment, all converted into ash because Parliament couldn't tell the difference between extraction and authority. The stamp was small. The receipt said subjects. The colonists read it, looked at each other, and decided that being commanded was worse than being taxed. If you open the British Treasury's books from those years, there's a line for projected Stamp Act revenue. Roughly £60,000 a year. The actual column, the one that records what was collected, is empty. Next to it, invisible in the ink, but screaming from every page of the history that followed, is a cost no accountant could measure in advance. Consent is not free, but losing consent turns out to be the most expensive thing an empire can do. The elm tree in Boston kept growing. They called it the Liberty Tree, and kept calling it that until British soldiers cut it down during the siege in 1775. But by then it didn't matter. The roots were already under the whole continent. The receipt had been stamped. Unpaid. Cost, all.